Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Biome Podcast. I'm Roby, and this is...
And I'm Emma.
Okay, a little overlap there, but we're fine. We're going to roll with it. And today we're going to talk to you about a UK conservation story, the Water Vole Crisis. That's a good way to describe it. Emma, what is a water vole and what is the crisis?
So I think a lot of us might not have seen a water vole in the wild.
I have not.
I think I maybe saw one once. Or didn't you see one on the field course where you're like, oh my goodness, a water vole?
Oh yeah, but well, when I say I saw it, I saw a splash in the water, which was too small for an otter.
See, that's the thing. That's what you're likely to, if you do see one or hear one, it's likely to be kind of that splash in the water. And the reason that you might not see one is because they are one of Britain's fastest declining mammals. I think they've been lost from like 90% of their former range. So that's figures from the 1900s. And they are massively, massively declining. So before I get carried away about what's going on with water voles, I will say what one is.
Yes, what is a water vole? Because when I think of a water vole, I think of Ratty from Wind in the Willows.
That's him. That's water vole.
Which is odd because Ratty you would have thought would be a rat, but
yeah, I feel like confusing name, but wildlife people do that a lot and are very confusing.
I mean, as the noted zoologist Rihanna once said, a rat is a rat. But anyway, what are water voles?
Noted zoologist. Interesting, Roby.
What are water voles? Tell us about the water voles.
Okay, so I'll throw in a Latin name because Roby loves his Latin names. So they are Arvicola amphibious.
Nice.
Interesting, which I think links to their semi-aquatic kind of lifestyle that they have. Mm-hmm. So they're rodents. So they look... Actually, I'll do a comparison with rats just so that people can kind of know how they're different from rats. So water voles kind of have this chubby, almost chipmunk-like face with these small rounded ears, whereas rats will have this long, slender snout and they have much larger ears.
And actually, you should be able to see this comparison on your screens now. So on the left, we have a water vole, and on the right, we have a rat. So we can edit that in.
And so if you see them in the water, both rats and water voles can swim. But water voles will be kind of floating a bit higher up in the water, whereas rats are more kind of, they actually sink into the water layer. What's some other differences? Oh, their tail, that's another one. So water voles have a furry tail, whereas rats will have a long, scaly tail. So there are quite a few differences between them. The rat is obviously larger, the water vole is smaller.
Yeah, how big is a water vole?
It can be 22 centimetres long. Mm-hmm. So trying to think in centimetres.
It's like that, isn't it? Maybe 22 centimetres?
Yeah, I'd say like 30 centimetres is like that. So probably, so quite small.
Yeah.
I think they weigh up to like 300 grams. So yeah,
not as much as a cave bear.
just not by much, like just a bit smaller. I mean, they're both brown and fluffy.
Yeah,
so.
you know.
And vegetarian.
Cave bears, water voles, what's the difference?
Because, that's another thing about water voles, that they eat a lot. So they are almost entirely herbivorous, so they'll eat things like reeds and grasses and nettles and things like that. And they can eat around 80% of their body weight in food every day. So,
Bit like me during winter.
Yeah. Just nibbling on a bunch of reeds in your garden.
Yeah, that's what I'm about. So, water voles, the name is fairly self-explanatory. They're voles which are about water. That's kind of where they go. So they've got quite a large Palearctic Eurasian range. So from the UK and the west of the range all the way to Siberia. And I think they're found as far north as the Arctic, which I guess is where the water starts freezing. So not very good if you're a water vole. And as far south as Iran, which is where there starts to be
that's a massive
not
range.
Much water. Yeah. And they're a typical kind of freshwater wetland species. So rivers, streams, wet ditches, ponds, marshes. Apparently they're quite like a nice slow flowing water current, maybe quite still water. They're not as strong swimmers as otters. They don't have quite such marine adaptation, so they don't like a fast flowing river or stream system. And part of this is also reflected in their habitat in terms of where they live. So they burrow into reed banks and river banks. And so they need a nice slow flowing stream, so they're not just kind of washed out of their burrows whenever the water rises. And this is probably, I would imagine, you're going to tell us a bit more about the threats they face, but this is the kind of angle that they get hit on. Their habitat is just going. Yeah,
their habitat is one of the biggest reasons why they have declined massively. So you don't just have to listen to me rambling. We're going to pull up a mind map, so hopefully people can visualize that a bit better. So I'd say probably the two biggest reasons why they've declined so much, like drastic declines. One of them, like you were saying, Roby, has been habitat loss. So you've got kind of intensification of farming practices, you've got livestock that are coming right up to the water's edge to graze. And obviously, like we were saying with kind of the reed beds and the moors and kind of the river edges, they need that cover, not only as a food source, but also from predators.
Yeah, as shelter, I bet.
Yeah. And because they've got other predators, so things like owls, raptors, red foxes, mustelids.
And I guess that's something to note, that if you are a kind of a mid-sized rodent living in the countryside, everything is a predator. So you really can't afford a big human impact to suddenly whack you on the head when already owls, birds of prey, foxes, otters, I'm sure otters will probably take a water vole. Everything eats you.
Yeah. I mean, we'll come back to the main thing that eats them, which is a problem. But kind of what you were saying about the human side of things. I mean, we've touched on this so much, just how our own behaviours are having a negative impact. So with water voles, you've got things like pollution of waterways, which is obviously affecting them. They're very small. They will kind of be able to, they'll take up a lot of toxins or contaminants and things like that, which is obviously dangerous. A big problem as well has been increased kind of housing development and the construction of transportation networks. So this is actually a big role for ecological consultants because they are legally protected. It means it's illegal to harm, kill, disturb, things like that, any aspect relating to water voles and their habitats. And so if there is a housing proposal or a transport link planned, and that happens to overlap with water vole territory, they then have to move the water voles from that site. It's illegal to keep going with the construction.
Well, at least that's good. At least they've got that legislative protection there, and so it's not just that they're being destroyed and no one's noticed. Like we do try at least to protect them, and I'm sure the canalisation of rivers will also have an effect. Every
we
podcast
always
we
talk
do,
about that.
Always the canalisation of rivers. But yeah, you really shouldn't canalise your rivers, guys. Everything lives in the riverbanks, like water voles.
And also with the riverbanks, an issue is when they silt the river. So if there's a risk of flooding and they're kind of clearing out the river, it's important that people only clear out the middle bit, because obviously if they start to clear out the sides and the banks, then that will destroy the bank. What word am I looking for? The burrows, that's it.
The burrows.
Destroy the burrows. So there's that. And then, like you're saying, though, it's quite positive that there's some efforts to try and mitigate the negative effects on them. But then ultimately, if you have a big housing development or transport links, that's going to separate colonies. And so if you can't have this mixing, then we've done this on our course quite a lot about how you can get lots of inbreeding, you can get kind of genetic bottlenecks in a way, which is equally dangerous.
And I assume being like a riverside species, they rely on connected river or stream systems in order to disperse between populations. They like a water vole won't just cross a high street to get from A to B. So a big development can, even if it doesn't harm water voles directly, if you put a big development between two adjacent river systems, you've effectively, I think, cut those two populations off. So there's going to be no genetic flow between the two.
Yeah, I think that's a big danger. So it's something that needs to be addressed. And then, so the main one, which I've left to last because it's the probably what's threatening them the most, along with habitat degradation, is predation by the American mink. So
Lovely. Or
this is
not lovely.
it's a new threat which has been introduced by humans.
Right.
So they were brought in from North. So this is the mink, not waterfalls. The
Yeah.
American mink were brought over from North America.
Funny that.
To be, I know, crazy.
I would have never have guessed.
To be part of the fur industry. So it's these massive fur farms with American mink, and they were either released or escaped. And because they're not native, before the water voles were able to, if they were being attacked by a predator, they could just jump into the water, and that was their means of escape. Or they could go into their burrow, and things like red foxes, badgers, they can't follow them. But the thing is, with American mink, they're very small. Like you've seen what a mink looks like. It's kind of very slender, kind
sausage-like
of
almost.
Yeah. Cross between like weasel, sausagey looking. But
Sausage
they
with
can,
teeth.
Yes, exactly. And these sausage-looking things, especially the females, are small enough. So they're strong swimmers, so they can follow them into the water, and also they can follow them into their burrows, so they can decimate population. Because there's nowhere for the voles to go. If they can't even hide in their burrows, then they're going to get predated.
And that's quite interesting because we do have a native mink species in the UK, the European mink, but the European mink is actually larger and so can't follow the water vole into the burrow. So in a natural ecosystem, you'll have both water voles and European mink, and they live in a certain balance in that the mink will predate on the voles, but it will never be able to take a vole that goes into the burrow. The American mink shakes all that up because it's small enough to go into the burrow, and so the system becomes unbalanced.
Yeah, and that's a. I mean, we're going to touch on this more in other podcasts, but about invasive species and kind of people. There's been a lot of controversy about controlling mink numbers, sort of by catching or trapping, sometimes killing them as well, because obviously, say, animal rights groups or activists will be like, oh, but you're taking another animal's life. How is that justifiable? But then it has to be a balance because we've brought them in and it's now decimating ecosystems. So in my mind, I kind of feel like that's a time for us to step in and intervene.
I would say that it is justifiable. I'm going to go out there and say that. As, a passionate zoologist, I think that if the option is, okay, we don't control the invasive mink and we let them live, we risk losing an entire native species. American mink are not endangered in their native habitats in North America. They're doing absolutely fine there. They are a plague here on native species, and this isn't some kind of weird, we need to protect British species. Like, not at all is that's what I'm saying. But when you have a native species getting underneath these massive declining pressures, we risk losing much more than we understand. And so I think we have a responsibility to control American mink, which are our own fault that we have unleashed on the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think that's a really good point, saying how we don't fully understand the effects that things can have on an ecosystem. So that is part of the reason why we need to conserve water voles as well, because we don't fully understand what the effect is going to be if they do go extinct. So I think someone put it really nicely. It was someone from the Essex Wildlife Trust, I think, saying that it's like wildlife Jenga. So if you remove a piece or you remove a species, say that is the water vole, you have no idea what the consequences are going to be further down the line. It might be okay. Your Jenga tower might still be standing and it's fully functional, but we've probably all played Jenga. It can come crashing down. And so I think that's why we don't understand enough to compromise losing it.
And I mean, the thing with the water voles, you've the two things which should spring to mind immediately, not being an expert on water voles, is, okay, well, if you lose the water voles, then you lose a substantial food source for owls, kestrels, falcons, buzzards, foxes, badgers, otters, and all of those species are under their own pressures and really can't afford to lose a food source, especially in times like winter. And also, if they have this effect of, burrowing into riverside banks, and they also have this effect of controlling riverside vegetation, then I'd worry that the health of our rivers would be threatened by overgrowth of the banks, which might, destabilise them. I'm not an expert, but those are the kind of impacts that you might expect to see. So obviously, this is quite a serious issue. is work being done on it? How are we? What's our response? What are we doing?
So luckily, this is quite a positive side of things, that there has been quite a good response to water vole conservation. And I don't agree with this side of conservation, but if something is cute and small and fluffy and gives you that awe factor, then people are likely to care about it. And luckily for the water vole, it is one of those
cute and fluffy things,
ones that people do. They are charismatic and people want to conserve them. So I'll sort of start small and then go bigger.
Why not?
So kind of with individuals, I could start with kind of what you could do as an individual and what individuals are doing. So there's loads of surveys now that you can be a part of. So you can be a water vole surveyor, which I think would be pretty cool. I think we should do that, Roby.
Yeah, let's do it.
So that's usually with the local wildlife trusts, and there's also a large-scale monitoring program called the National Water Vole Monitoring Program.
Ooh, I love something like that.
Yeah, I think it's amazing when it all feeds into each other, and there's this brilliant. Let me just find it. So it's the National Water Vole Database and Mapping Project.
Oh, I love a database.
And it's really extensive. So what they're doing with this particular mapping project is they're combining American mink and water vole data points and recordings and sightings and things like that. So what the aim is to create this geographical information system. I love my geographical information systems.
For the record, Emma is hella into GIS mapping, which is amazing, I think.
I want to get better at it so I can map voles. But so what they're doing by combining these mink and water vole sightings and sort of data points into this huge map, what they have done is they're able to create what's called alert maps. So then they can target areas that would be suitable for things like habitat restoration, to restore areas that would be good for water voles, or areas that would be good for increasing connectivity between populations. And then also by having the mink data in there as well, what that does is you don't want to release a bunch of water voles into an area where there's a bunch of mink.
That would be a bad idea.
It would be a very bad idea.
That would be lunch for the mink.
So even if you are studying one particular species, I think it's really important that you do consider sort of the wider knock-on effects. So you do need to consider the mink. You do need to consider the vegetation when we're talking about water voles. So yeah, I thought that the mapping project sounded incredible.
That sounds amazing. And there's also quite a lot of ecological consultancy going on with water voles, as I understand. So Derek Gow Consultancy, who's quite a leading figure in kind of wetland ecosystem restoration, I think, hasn't he set up like the largest breeding centre for water voles in the UK, captive breeding for them to then be released?
Yeah, no, Derek Gow is amazing. Like, we've talked about him in regards to beavers recently, but he's one of the leading specialists in kind of breeding, housing, and then rehabilitating water voles in the UK. And I think it's something like he's released over 25,000 water voles in the time that he's been working with them. And so I think he did a big collaboration as well with the Essex Wildlife Trust, where they kind of came together and formed a large population of water voles which could then be released.
Oh, that's cool. And I assume that's got quite a nice genetic diversity if they're merging their water voles.
Yeah, so it's all very carefully managed how they're being bred. And there is another really cool organisation called Wildwood, which they're the bison people.
The bison people, yeah. We love the bison people. So
not only are they involved in this new bison project that's coming up, which we're not going to say about because you're going to hear about that later. But so what they do, they are really, really key with water vole reintroduction and rehabilitation. So they work alongside ecological consultants. So what they do is if there is a project going ahead that might be damaging to water voles or their habitat, they will keep them in this quarantine area. And so they've got the perfect kind of enclosures for them, everything they need. They have thorough health checks and things when they arrive. And if they do end up having to stay longer than anticipated, they will use them to be part of their captive breeding program. So
that's cool. That's good.
Yeah, I think it's amazing because they're just building up this kind of source of water voles that can then be released once the habitat becomes suitable. So they are doing some really, really, really great work, and they offer training courses and things like that. It's not just them, it's kind of engaging the wider community to be part of it as well, with surveys and things, which is
That's fantastic. I love a nice integrated, well organised, well thought out conservation project which deals with both habitat and the animals and genetics and make sure that's all good. I love that. Because, you do hear stories about conservation gone wrong, like the Italians tried to reintroduce lynx in Gran Paradiso, and they introduced 2, and they were both male and they were both brothers. So that didn't work, but it looks like these voles have got some really good people behind them and some really good work behind them. So that's probably quite a nice positive place to wrap up on this one, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that people are doing on voles. Like, I'm sorry if I haven't given everyone credit for all the awesome work that they're doing with voles, but well, as usual, we'll share the links to where we got this information from, and there's some really, really great resources about water vole conservation. And you can be a part of that as well. There's a big scheme of, if you see one, it's important that you kind of map it, and you can take a picture of it or report it where you saw it, and that's vital data for kind of the future of their conservation. So yeah.
And you can probably get involved with that through your local wildlife trust.
Yeah, a lot of wildlife trusts are doing that.
Yeah. The other place is NBN Atlas, which is a very good place, which I use quite a lot for research in order to find where recent sightings of species have been. That's a really cool asset and resource as well. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Biome Podcast with me, Roby, and
Emma. And so if you want to stay up to date with what we're doing with podcasts that are coming up, you can look for the Biome Podcast on YouTube and at Biome by Grizzly on Instagram. And then also we'll be posting stuff about various cool research topics as we're making these podcasts. So we are Emma Hodson Wildlife and Roby Watkinson Wildlife on Instagram.
Yeah.
So, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.